Welcome to the other side of Lucy Letby. But one of the reasons I want to do this podcast is because the guys actually mentioned me in their podcast. So as I say, I'm not going to go into an awful lot of detail about what they said because it's a lot of legalese and jargon and junk that I don't particularly find very interesting. But I do wish them good luck with their podcast because at least they're willing to talk about things like this. One of them says to the other, right, should we start with some of the stuff that he's been reading? Tim Owen says, I've spent a number of weeks combing through mainly YouTube, so I don't think YouTube is mainly the best source of information on Lucy Letby, but anyway, if you put Lucy Letby into the YouTube search engine, you'll come up with a vast quantity of material. I find if you put anything into YouTube, you'll pretty much come up with a vast quantity of material, but anyway. And it varies from pure crackpot conspiracy theorists to either more serious individuals who have attempted to get to grips with some of the evidence, or as far as they can get hold of it, all of the evidence in the case. But the common theme of all of them is something I think we want to concentrate on today. And of course, none of them have analysed or perhaps even read the 58-page judgment of the Court of Appeal handed down on the 2nd of July this year. Well, I'm one of these crackpot conspiracy theorists, and I have read the Court of Appeal 58-page judgment several times, and I will actually do a separate podcast on it and why I think it just shows up the whole legal system for what it is. It's very difficult for people who are clinicians or scientists to make any sense of all of this legal stuff. So he says that although this was an application for leave to appeal, it was in effect a full hearing of all the grounds with which the Court of Appeal determined were not arguable. So there's where law and science seriously depart. Everything in science is arguable all the time. Just to give you a little kind of example, off the cuff, I remember reading somewhere about Albert Einstein, one of my great heroes in life. And Albert was part of Princeton University. He wasn't actually a professor, but he was a big part of the research team into the last job he had in his life. And one of his roles apparently was to set the exams for physics students at Princeton. And a complaint came in about Albert that he was always setting exactly the same questions. And the Board of Governors, or whoever they are, looked at this allegation and found that it was true. So Albert was called into the office and asked, what's the story here? You're always asking the same questions. And Albert said to them, well, the questions don't change. The answers do. Albert was making the point that when it comes to science, there are no such thing as an end to questions. There are only different answers. And the different answers over the years clarify a lot of things. 58-page judgment handed down on the 2nd of July. I hope we can't take as holy writ, which is what a lot of the law seems to be, precedent, because people made a decision before, they'll make another decision again. That doesn't make sense to a scientist. So one of the podcasts he mentions, right, was We Need to Talk About Lucy Letby, which was a podcast I was in. It's presented by two men. This is what they say. One is a guy called Peter Alston. He's a retired fund manager, and as he himself describes himself, an amateur statistician. And the other is a man called Michael McConville, that's me, who's a retired doctor from Northern Ireland. Well, I am a retired doctor, not from Northern Ireland. Basically, these two men over these 20 episodes discussed the case as they have understood it, as I can see from media reports. Well, that's not strictly true. I mean, we spent a lot of time discussing the Royal College of Pediatrics and Child Health report into the Countess of Chester Hospital, which was not a very good read for the Countess of Chester Hospital. and had nothing to do with the media. It was reported widely in the media, but the report was a serious review into this service where Lucy Letby worked, and it was pretty damning, really. And the conclusion of the report really, when it comes down to everything else, the conclusion of the report was that the Countess of Chester Hospital was never fit to act as a level 2 unit, so it should never have acted as a level 2 unit. And that is one of the major problems that I have with the conviction of Lucy Letby. And as soon as the Royal College of Paediatric Child Health reviewed the hospital after a voluntary downgrade, when they downgraded themselves to a level 3 unit, which only looks after babies after 32 weeks, so much, much more mature babies than even 30 weeks or 31 weeks. And mainly that maturity would be found in the ability of the lungs to exchange gas relatively easy. So that is something that wasn't mentioned at all in the trial, that the Royal College of Paediatrics and Child Health agreed with the downgrading of this hospital. This Lucy Letby podcast goes on to say that our starting point seemed to be that she was innocent and therefore was wrongly convicted. That's pretty true. Then he says, we attacked the way that the prosecution presented the case, suggesting almost bad faith and distortion in the way they presented the evidence. That's not strictly true. We did say on many occasions that the prosecution made false statements, but false statements in the sense that they weren't scientifically correct. But the prosecutor can really only work with what he's got. So the CPS of the Crown Prosecution Service presumably drew together a case for him, and then he made the best of what information he was given. But the information he was given was, in our opinion, not correct. What else can the prosecutor say but what he's been told? Like, I think the biggest example of this, which we've covered in the last podcast, is the example of BBA, the so-called index case, or what I call the golden thread. And the basic opening statement by the prosecutor that a 31-week neonate born by emergency section, the baby being small for gestational age, born to a mother with antiphospholipid syndrome and preeclampsia under general anaesthetic, that came out and needed resuscitation within a short period of being born, so therefore had the definition of birth asphyxia. Went on immediately to CPAP, was diagnosed with sepsis, had high lactates and constantly high tachypnea throughout the day, was a stable baby. Now, nobody in their right mind would say that that was a stable baby. This was repeated time and time and time again in this trial, that they were all stable babies. And apparently then going on that we attacked the defence for failing to put a proper defence in. Effectively, what we were saying in the last podcast that ended on June the 30th, that we were effectively saying that the defence was poor. Well, I actually don't think that. I think Ben Myers did a really good job, but what he failed or wasn't able to do was he wasn't able to make his point stick. So he did attack these so-called prosecution witnesses. He attacked them very well. He got them to contradict themselves. He exposed them quite well, but he didn't expose them enough. And he didn't put forward a counter argument with authority of another doctor. So if you're the jury, you're listening to one lawyer who's defending a girl, but of course he's going to say that. But you've got 6 experts or 7 experts or as many as they had saying the opposite. Yeah, that's what we were saying, that it was a mistake in our view not to call a contrary medical opinion. And he goes on, interestingly, Tim Owens goes on, interestingly, to say that the last podcast we did we need to talk about Lucy Letby was 2 days before the Court of Appeal judgment, and that may be significant. Well, it wasn't significant. The reason that we stopped doing the podcast, as I explained on Twitter, I think, and in the first episode of The Other Side of Lucy Letby, Peter and I discussed his new role in behind the scenes in the fight for Lucy Letby, and we kind of agreed that it probably wasn't appropriate to do such a casual conversation in a podcast if Peter was going to be quoted in the papers and things like that. So that was the reason. It was nothing to do with the Court of Appeal, because we don't agree with the opinion of the Court of Appeal either. Then, bizarrely, Peter said, in one of the episodes, Peter said he referred to a lecture that he had attended at the Royal Statistics Society, which he's a member, talking about evidence of Florence Nightingale reducing the mortality statistics during the Crimean War with basic sort of hand washing and all of that. So this is what the lawyer said, hand washing of all of that. So how important is hand washing and all of that, and how wrong are these two guys to dismiss hand washing and all of that? There are huge studies done into this and how much hand washing reduces the mortality in preterm neonates. So, for example, there's one large cohort study of 23,626 neonates, and they found that hand washing was associated with lower neonatal mortality by a significant amount. A big study in Nepal found that regular maternal hand washing, this was at home, in the first 14 days of life, was associated with a major reduction in all-cause mortality. So hand washing as a neonatal intensive care unit are critical to intensive care provision. Not doing hand washing and all of that is a big cause of mortality, which is what we're actually talking about here. So to dismiss that and to dismiss Peter saying that shows that these lawyers don't really understand how important something as simple as hand washing is to medicine. So they carry on and go, and that this is linked to the issue about Lucy Letby having called the only defence witness other than herself, but that was the plumber, who gave evidence about sewage problems in the hospital and the implications. This was never put forward as expert evidence. Maybe these babies had died as a result of pollution, the lawyers say, which infected them from sewage. I'm sorry, guys, but sewage is not pollution. Sewage is a breeding ground of pathogenic, antibiotic-resistant pathogens that are lethal to preterm neonates. And the fact that sewage was not discussed, in fact, it was dismissed by the prosecution during the trial because the sewage leak didn't happen in the unit itself. That was a major failing of the defence, not to call epidemiologists, microbiologists, and people to talk about neonatal sepsis, which is the leading cause of neonatal mortality in the world. So we don't discuss the leading cause of neonatal mortality in the world, and these guys put it down to hand washing and that sort of thing, and pollution, which has got nothing to do with pollution. And then they actually do talk about the fact that there was some revelation a few weeks ago, and that was about an opportunistic bug called Pseudomonas aeruginosa, which has caused multiple outbreaks of neonatal sepsis and high levels of fatality in neonatal units. And there are many, many references to that. And one of the things that Pseudomonas causes is a pneumonia type illness in preterm neonate. There was a lot of that in this unit. So again, I'll talk about that on a different podcast, but I think they reveal their ignorance about the dangers of the sewage, biofilm, DNA swap for antibody resistance, all that kind of stuff. And then bizarrely, Ken goes on in the podcast to say that we reminded him of a TV series called Murders in the Building, which is a sort of comedy drama with Steve Martin. So it says, yeah, we need to talk about Lucy Letby is a bit like, so that's one category. So I don't dwell too much on this, as I say, I'll leave it like, but the second category, they had a kind of go at Phil Hammond. Phil, of course, being MD for Private Eye. And Phil has been very courageous, putting his neck above the line, but he really doesn't need to. And the two things that Phil and myself and Peter Alston and others is that we're saying that missing an expert witness view on the existing evidence was a major failure. In the podcast, the guys go on, the prosecution used 6 expert witnesses, the defence used none. But the guys don't seem to realise that Gary Evans, the main witness who came up with the whole theory about Lucy Letby murdering babies, that he told the court he was independent of the prosecution, that he wasn't a prosecution witness, and yet he's described as one in this podcast and practically everywhere else you see. And these two lawyers make another comment that MD Phil Hammond had a lengthy email exchange with one of the frontline consultants at Chester following detailed doubts about the interpretation of the evidence. And I've no doubt his belief that Letby is not guilty is genuine, but I was not convinced that his explanations were beyond reasonable doubt. So this is Phil, even Phil's opinions and concerns were beyond reasonable doubt. Or, I don't know what that means. So Phil Hammond said that he planned to ask for an independent opinion from a very senior practicing neonatologist. This consultant in Chester and Phil agreed that she would give a fair and balanced opinion. This is the view of the senior neonatologist. Quote, I've only seen the prosecution summarising an opening statement. I've not been privy to the details of the evidence, but what I've read troubles me deeply. The cases all have much more plausible alternative explanations than those alleged. And yeah, they do. That would be death by natural causes that were reported in 6 out of 7 babies who had postmortems, which these guys don't mention at all, which the court didn't mention at all, and which the appeal didn't mention at all. So it kind of, you think to yourself, what's the point of doing postmortems, which are very time-consuming, expensive, but are really detailed and very educational for doctors. Just let's have a quick look at some of these postmortem findings. BBA, of course, unascertained. It's pretty common to find or to give an unascertained cause of death. They're coded in the International Classification of Disease as other ill-defined and unspecified causes of mortality. Postmortems are vital for the practice of medicine. Pathology is vital for the practice of medicine, and it didn't make any appearance at all in this trial. BBC, it was widespread hypoxic ischemic damage to the heart and myocardium due to lung disease. So widespread hypoxic, that's no oxygen, ischemic damage to the heart, that is oxygen supply cut off to the heart because of lung disease. That was what pathologists said caused the death of baby C. Baby D had pneumonia with acute lung injury, and acute lung injury is not trauma to the lungs, it's inflammation to the lungs, which would inevitably follow, and it would be out of control inflammation that would just hammer the lungs and destroy the ability to exchange gas. And that was the finding in that one. Baby A, of course, didn't have a postmortem. In baby I, hypoxic ischemic damage of the brain and chronic lung disease due to prematurity, and one day extreme prematurity. So prematurity would be about the second highest cause of death, and hypoxic ischemic damage of the brain, again, is one of the leading causes of death. But it was due, according to the pathologist, not to Lucy Letby, but due to prematurity and extreme prematurity. And the death of baby O was death by natural causes with prematurity. Now, again, we will go into these things in detail when we cover each one of these. But we're looking really at babies around 1,600 grams, 800 grams, 1,300 grams, 504 grams. All of them by emergency cesarean section. Very low birth weight, extremely low birth weight. Twins, triplets, which are all much, much higher mortality than singleton babies. Practically all of them had respiratory distress syndrome, again, which is one of the leading causes of death. Practically all of them had birth asphyxia to some extent. Most of them had some kind of metabolic acidosis. Most of them had red flags for sepsis and other sepsis risk. Most of them were on antibiotics, if not all of them. And most of them had resuscitation that involved adrenaline, which in adrenaline itself is a risk factor for death. So, we have a huge amount of pathological evidence, none of which has seen its way into the court. And so the guys go on to say, so this is the opinion of somebody that's the neonatal expert. As she says, that has not been privy to the details of the evidence. She hasn't seen the evidence. No, she's just read the prosecution's opening statement, and on that basis, she expresses that view. And I can tell you, as a physician who is not a specialist in neonatology, that is more than enough to express serious concern. When you read a whole list of things like air embolism and feeding babies with milk and putting out air into their stomach, you scratch your head as a physician and go, when did that become a cause of death? When did that become a cause of death? So what the neonatologist has actually said is, if I seen these files, I read these files, I could probably explain that the opening statement, without any detail, is a serious problem. And the detail is really not going to alter the fundamental story that the prosecution is saying. But anyway, they go on, and particularly there's a lot of comment from very senior, well-regarded statisticians who don't seem to have any understanding at all of the breadth of the case, of the detail of the case, and just homing in on one particular thing, which is a statistical analysis of whether the famous chart showing that she was present at each event had statistical significance. The biggest problem with the statistical evidence for me, and I mean the people are obviously much more qualified to talk about this than I am, but it doesn't, statistics is important in medicine because it's what you use to prove that treatments work. For instance, Darry Evans himself said he was given 33 cases. If he had been given 33 cases that people obviously thought suspicious, well, Letby wasn't charged with 33 cases. She was charged, I think, with 22, but it was a portion of the 33 cases. So if you had put all 33 cases into that file, would Letby's name have been present on all of them? And unless you have the details of all 33 cases, you're looking at Letby in isolation, and you're claiming that there was actually 2 clusters that happened at the same time. Well, in medicine, it's possible to get 2 clusters, but I've never read of it happening, and I can't find any evidence of 2 clusters happening at once. So it's statistically extremely significant. So they talk about the welter of other evidence. Well, actually, there isn't really a welter of other evidence. It's just kind of theory and circumstance, most of it. And then they go on to say, yeah, well, that chart, this is the famous chart that they talk about, which was put before the jury, presumably as an agreed chart in terms of admission of the facts that she was on the duty at various events. And as I pointed out before, you can't isolate an event in a continuum of disease. If a baby starts on the downward path of not being able to produce and distribute enough energy in the body, that path is going to continue until you intervene. Now, it's not going to show that decline. It'll show it maybe at phases, at stages, through symptomatology, through very subtle tests and different things. But the event starts long before the time when you notice it. So to pick out events in the treatment and the development of the pathophysiology of disease in anyone is, again, not very accurate in terms of medicine. Because someone has a myocardial infarction, for instance. Did the myocardial infarction happen that day? No, it didn't. It, for most part, happened when they developed atherosclerosis, and that could have been 20 years before. And there would have been multiple opportunities within that 20-year period to alter the inevitability of the heart attack. That doesn't make any sense. They go on to talk about the statistics, but there's plenty of stuff out there, and I don't really want to go on much more about the statistics. So they say the evidence of harm being inflicted and that natural causes was not an explanation, was not informed. I mean, the importance of the chart was that it was accepted by everyone. I think at least 2 of the infants had been deliberately harmed, and therefore the fact that it was only Lucy Letby who was present at every event took a significance which was not to do with formal statistic analysis. Well, I think they're talking about the 2 insulin cases. The 2 insulin cases are really empty of any evidence at all in terms of medical practice, in terms of science, in terms of forensic science. There's no forensic evidence at all that these babies were poisoned by insulin. And Lucy Letby had, as Ben Meyer said, the Nostradamus ability to spike 2 bags in the knowledge that one of them would be changed a few hours later. The guys don't really seem to have got to grips with that. They've read the appeal court judgment, but I'm not so sure that they've read the copious amounts of excellent court reporting from Dan O'Donoghue of the Chester Evening Standard, who, and Dan, I think, did a very, very good job. She was present at every event. Well, we also know that the swipe data that showed the coming and going to this unit may not necessarily have been accurate. So was Lucy Letby present at every event? I think that remains to be seen. And certainly in the retrial that they're talking about, in the case of baby K, Lucy Letby was not alone at the time of the so-called event. There was 2 nurses there, and yet the jury found her guilty. So it doesn't seem as if any one piece of this evidence is enough. It's a sense, a feeling, an opinion, a gut feeling that this girl must be guilty. But that really isn't what forensic medicine, pathology and stuff is about, gut feelings. It's exactly the opposite of that. And then you hear people saying, oh, it was just circumstantial evidence. I mean, the facts of the matter is that circumstantial evidence can be the most compelling. And yeah, absolutely. But that's why we have science. We have science to say, well, is this compelling story actually possible? Or is it actually true? Because we have a vast reservoir of knowledge against which we can test these compelling assumptions. And very often the compelling assumptions don't turn out to be possible, let alone true. So again, the postmortems, they weren't mentioned at all, or they were hardly mentioned, and they weren't certainly explored in any detail during the trial. The prosecution said, for instance, in the case of baby A, that Letby was the only one present at the collapse. Well, there was 5 people in a very small room when the baby collapsed. And again, the baby K retrial, there was 2 people, or not 1. And again, referring to the insulin cases, which for whatever reason that nobody knows, found its way into agreed evidence. But what was the scientific evidence or the forensic evidence? So can a single C-peptide and insulin immunoassay determine insulin poisoning? No, it can't. And I doubt whether it would ever be sufficient in any other jurisdiction. But to bundle it in with a whole load of circumstances means you have to choose to ignore the science and what we know about insulin and immunoassay tests. So a single C-peptide insulin measurement alone cannot definitively prove factitious insulin poisoning in a preterm neonate. There's just no way. So yes, the insulin to C-peptide ratio in normal physiology in adults would suggest that if the insulin was high, the C-peptide was practically non-existent, that may suggest exogenous insulin administration, but it doesn't prove it. The staggering thing was the sheer size of the insulin measurement in BBF, for instance, 4,600 plus picomoles per liter is enormously unsurvivable amount of insulin in the blood, but yet the baby survived. An adult wouldn't even survive. But in preterms, the fact is that the physiological characteristics that affect insulin and C-peptide levels are just not the same. The clearance of the metabolism of C-peptide and the clearance differs completely from adults. You cannot, they're false equivalents. You can't use those same measurements and those same implications when you're talking about preterm neonates who don't have settled or even established physiology by which you're going to measure all these things, you know. And there are more specific analytical techniques, like liquid chromatography, mass spectrometry, will identify these insulin, whereas the immunoassays really don't. So then they go on. They talk about that Lucy Letby retained the same legal team. We will no doubt in time find out why that was the case. I still like the point that I think Ben Myers, when you actually read all of the points he made and how he kind of picked apart these expert witnesses, I think he did a very good job. But he didn't have enough clout with the jury. I don't know whether that was something that Ben Myers considered. It's kind of disappointing because I think that he was on top of it to a certain extent, but it was the impact that it would have on the jury. The plumber, for instance, was a really, really missed opportunity. The fact that we know that there was a pseudomonas infection in that ward for a long period of time in a tap, producing biofilm and God knows what else. How dangerous is sewage in a neonatal ICU? Multi-drug resistant pathogens, contaminated sinks, drains, plumbings, direct contact with these, aerosolization, putting this stuff into the air and on the healthcare workers' hands, and the particularly vulnerable population. So it has serious, serious consequences, lead to sepsis and increased mortality in hospital stays. Once it's there, it's incredibly difficult to control these reservoirs of bacteria if you can control them at all. And multiple stories again, which I'll show you, document outbreaks of multi-drug resistant bacteria in neonatal intensive care units linked to contaminated water systems and sinks. It's just a really serious problem that wasn't discussed. They go on to talk then about Dr. Shu Lee, who was the neonatologist who was the half the team who wrote the Lee and Tanswell paper, which was quoted a lot in this trial. They talk about the judges being very experienced, very senior judges, yes, and very, very experienced and very senior surgeons and physicians can make mistakes all the time, and they do all the time, because we're all human. I mean, I retired on the 1st of January. Probably the last patient I see was just before Christmas, and that was probably the last time I made a mistake. They go on that, there was no other explanation other than homicide. Well, bollocks, as we would say in Ireland. There's the post-mortem results. Our embolism as a cause of collapse or death in a neonate is not a bogus medical theory. No, it's not. The fact that our embolism can occur in neonates is not in dispute, but the appeal court judges rejected it on the basis that it wasn't in dispute. But the mechanism and the means of determining that it was our embolism are clearly in dispute. The two lawyers again say that the real issue at trial was as to what signs and symptoms were sufficient to enable a reliable diagnosis of our embolism. No, signs and symptoms would not be sufficient to provide a reliable diagnosis of our embolism. No, it would not, because they're too generalized and non-specific. And our embolism, of course, is forcible injection of air, usually into the bloodstream, according to these guys, which causes an embolism in the same way as a clot does. No, it doesn't. And there are multiple ways that air gets into the system, and it doesn't necessarily have to be forcible. And we'll look at that in a minute, because they do describe that in the 1989 paper, which no one else seems to have read. So this is one of the mechanisms alleged by the prosecution. Well, it wasn't really. I mean, they just used an arbitrary number. Lucy Letby injected 5 mils of air 1 or 2 minutes before the collapses. Well, and that's not consistent with a lot of these diagnoses, because they didn't happen within 1 or 2 minutes. In fact, in one of the cases, Lucy Letby took a blood gas at 12:15 at night, and the baby collapsed 15 minutes later. That's not 1 or 2 minutes. That doesn't stick with the same Darry Evans theory of our embolism. And we have to ask why. And she used 5 mils of air, which is 1 mil of oxygen, that I talked about before. So it's bollocks to say that 1 mil of oxygen is going to behave the same way as the litres of oxygen that were pumped into babies in the Lee and Tanswell paper. So then they go on to quote the one little bit of this paper that gets constantly quoted, and is quoted in the appeal court judgment. Blotching and migrating areas of cutaneous pallor were noted in several cases. When you can get blanching and migrating areas of cutaneous pallor in practically any disease in a preterm neonate or any neonate, even adults, that result in shock. And then the contentious bit, this we attribute it to direct oxygenation of erythrocytes adjacent to free air in the vascular system, while the tissues continue to be purely perfused and oxygenated. Well, that was an attribution that Lee and Tanswell made in an observational study, but they had no proof of it. And as I've said before, when you oxygenate hemoglobin, it doesn't turn pink, it turns red. So the pink has to come from something other than the direct oxygenation of erythrocytes. The pink has to be the effect of a mixture of red and white. So it's got to do with the lighting in the room, the angle of viewing it. There's a whole host of reasons. It can also be due to the presence of oxygen opening up previously closed pathways. And yet, this direct oxygenation theory is also quoted by the judges in the appeal court, which I don't think Tim Owens has read or understands. Excessive quantities of milk, force feeding of milk, not discussed in the trial. How is the force feeding of milk possible through a 2 mil tube? How is it a cause of death? How is the forcible injection of air into the stomach a cause of death when the actual CPAP machine to which the baby is attached is pumping 6 to 8 litres a minute of air into that system, a good portion of which is going into the gut all the time, but it doesn't cause death. So we'll end this podcast now, but I would encourage you to listen to these guys. And I said, I wish them all the luck with the podcast. And I just really scratched the surface, and I will leave you the links. In the next episode, we are going to take another side turn, and I'm going to really look at the Lee and Tanswell paper, and they try and explain it to a 4-year-old, how it works, and why it isn't appropriate to use it in this case. And then after that, we are going to look, just to keep the two lawyers happy, we're going to go through the Court of Appeal judgment in the case of Lucy Letby. So we'll see you in the next couple of episodes. Bye.